Their bunkers weren't bunkers anymore. What had been reinforced concrete and steel, what the Japanese had spent months building into the coral and rock of Iwo Jima, was now nothing but smoking craters and twisted metal. I watched through my binoculars from the bridge of the USS Iowa as our 16-inch shells, each one weighing as much as a small car, transformed the landscape of that godforsaken island into something that looked like the surface of the moon. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and I served as a gunnery officer aboard the Iowa during the bombardment of Iwo Jima in February 1945. What I witnessed during those 3 days of pre-invasion shelling would stay with me for the rest of my life. It was the most devastating display of naval firepower the world had ever seen, and I had a front row seat to watch American steel rain down on Japanese positions with precision that defied belief. The morning of February 16, 1945, dawned gray and cold in the Pacific. The Iowa, along with her sister ships Missouri and Wisconsin, plus the older battleships Nevada, Tennessee, Arkansas, New York, and Texas, formed the most powerful bombardment fleet ever assembled. Our target was an 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. Intelligence told us that 22,000 Japanese defenders were dug into that island, waiting for us in tunnels, caves, and bunkers that connected like an underground city. Admiral Raymond Spruance himself had given us our orders: soften up Iwo Jima before the Marines hit the beaches. What he didn't say, but what we all understood, was that every pillbox we destroyed, every gun emplacement we silenced, every bunker we collapsed meant Marines would come home alive. I stood on the Iowa's bridge at 0630 hours, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to the first light of what would become a historic day. Captain John McCrae was reviewing the fire plan one final time with the navigation team. The smell of coffee and diesel fuel mixed with the salt air as 2,700 men prepared for battle. "Morrison," Captain McCrae called out. "What's the status on turret number 2? "Ready in all respects." "Sir," I replied, checking my clipboard. "All 3 16-inch guns loaded with armor-piercing shells. Range to target, 18,000 yards." The captain nodded. Below us, I could see the massive turret slowly rotating toward Iwo Jima. Each of the Iowa's 3 main turrets housed 3 16-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on an American warship. When all 9 guns fired together, the Iowa displaced sideways in the water from the sheer force of the blast. At exactly 0700 hours, the order came down from the flag bridge: commence firing. The world exploded. The first salvo from the Iowa's forward turrets sent a shockwave through the entire ship. The blast was so powerful it knocked coffee cups off tables 3 decks below. A column of orange flame shot out from each gun barrel, followed by a cloud of smoke that temporarily obscured our view of the target. But I didn't need to see the impact to know what was happening on Iwo Jima. Each shell carried nearly 3,000 pounds of high explosive, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second. Through my binoculars, I watched the shells impact the island 25 seconds later. Geysers of black smoke and debris erupted from the northern beaches where the Japanese had concentrated their defensive positions. The sound of the explosions rolled back across the water like thunder. "Target the concrete bunkers on the northern slope," came the fire control order through my headset. "Range 18500 yards. I relayed the coordinates to turret number 2. The massive guns elevated slightly, their crews working with practiced precision. Loading a 16-inch shell required a team of 8 men and a hydraulic rammer. The shell itself was 6 feet long and weighed 2,700 pounds, more than most automobiles. "Ready to fire," came the report from the turret. Fire. The second salvo was even more devastating than the first. I watched through my glasses as 3 shells impacted within 50 yards of each other, right on target. A Japanese bunker that had been visible on the ridgeline simply vanished, replaced by a crater 40 feet across. Chunks of concrete the size of automobiles were thrown hundreds of feet into the air. But we were just getting started. The USS Missouri, positioned 2,000 yards to our starboard, opened up with her own 9 16-inch guns. Then the Wisconsin joined in. The older battleships added their 14-inch guns to the barrage. The combined firepower was beyond imagination. Every 15 seconds, dozens of shells weighing more than a ton each crashed into Iwo Jima with the force of freight trains. Lieutenant Bobby Chen, my assistant gunnery officer, stood beside me with a stopwatch and notebook, recording each salvo. "Sir, we fired 36 rounds from the main battery in the first 8 minutes," he reported, having to shout over the constant roar of gunfire. "Keep tracking it, Chen," I shouted back. "The Marines are going to want to know exactly what we hit." The bombardment continued without pause. Our spotting aircraft, flying high above the island, radioed back corrections and new targets. "Iowa, this is Spotter 1. You've got a battery of artillery pieces in the rocks at coordinates 2748. Request fire mission." I grabbed the radio handset. "Spotter 1, this is Iowa Fire Control. We have the target. Stand by." Within minutes, our shells were falling on the Japanese artillery position. The spotting pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Direct hit. Direct hit. That battery is completely destroyed. Beautiful shooting, Iowa." As the morning wore on, the destruction became almost surreal. The island of Iwo Jima was literally being reshaped by American naval gunfire. Entire hillsides collapsed under the weight of our shells. The Japanese had spent months building what they thought were impregnable fortifications, but they had never faced 16-inch naval rifles before. Seaman First Class Danny Rodriguez, one of the shell handlers in turret number 2, came up to the bridge during a brief lull in the firing. His face was blackened with powder residue, and his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool February air. "Sir," he said, breathing heavily, "the boys in the turret wanted me to ask, how many rounds have we fired so far?" I checked my log. "Turret 2 has fired 42 rounds since we started. The entire ship has put out over 130 shells." Rodriguez whistled low. "Each one of those shells cost more than my dad made in 5 years, he said. "I sure hope they're doing some good." "Rodriguez," I said, pointing toward Iwo Jima, "take a look at that island and tell me if you think they're doing some good." The young sailor raised a pair of binoculars and studied the target. Where the morning had revealed a heavily fortified island bristling with gun positions and concrete bunkers, there was now a moonscape of craters and rubble. Smoke rose from dozens of impact points, and even from 18,000 yards away, we could see that the Japanese defensive positions had been systematically destroyed. "Holy cow, sir," Rodriguez breathed. "It looks like somebody took a giant sledgehammer to the whole place." That was exactly what we had done. The Iowa-class battleships were the sledgehammers of the Pacific Fleet, and we were using them to pound Iwo Jima into submission. By noon, we had been firing continuously for 5 hours. The gun barrels were so hot they glowed red, and we had to pause periodically to let them cool. During one of these breaks, Captain McRae gathered the senior officers on the bridge. "Gentlemen," he said, "we've expended over 200 rounds of 16-inch ammunition this morning. That's more firepower than some entire World War I battles. But intelligence indicates the Japanese still have significant defensive capabilities remaining." He pointed to an aerial photograph of the island. "The enemy has built an extensive tunnel system connecting their positions. Many of their guns are mounted on rails, so they can be moved quickly from one firing position to another. We need to keep pounding them until we're certain we've neutralized their ability to resist the Marine landing." Lieutenant Commander Tom Williams, our communications officer, spoke up. "Sir, we're getting reports from the other battleships in the formation. The Missouri has fired over 180 rounds, the Wisconsin nearly the same. The older battleship Salvo added another 400 rounds of 14-inch fire. In total, the fleet has put over 1,500 heavy shells into that island." Captain McRae nodded grimly. "And we're going to keep firing until we've put 1,500 more into it, if that's what it takes." The afternoon bombardment was even more intense than the morning session. We had identified specific targets now: command bunkers, ammunition dumps, artillery positions that had revealed themselves by firing back at us. The Japanese were not going quietly. Despite the devastating bombardment, some of their guns were still operational, and they began returning fire in the early afternoon. I was adjusting range on turret number 3 when I heard a whistling sound overhead, followed by a tremendous splash about 200 yards off our port bow. A geyser of water shot up nearly as high as our main mast. "Incoming fire," Someone shouted over the intercom. Japanese shore battery has found our range. The enemy's shell had been close, too close. If it had hit the Iowa, it could have caused significant damage and casualties. But Captain McCrae didn't even consider withdrawing from the bombardment line. All guns, concentrate fire on the enemy battery that just engaged us, he ordered calmly. Let's show them what American naval gunfire can do. Within 3 minutes, all 9 off Iowa's 16-inch guns were trained on the Japanese battery that had dared to shoot back at us. The salvo that followed was devastating. 9 shells, each weighing over a ton, impacted the enemy position simultaneously. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a crater in the rock. The Japanese battery never fired again. As the day wore on, the destruction became almost monotonous. Target after target was identified, engaged, and destroyed. The spotter planes reported that entire sections of the Japanese defense network had been obliterated. Ammunition dumps exploded in spectacular fireballs that could be seen from 20 miles away. Concrete bunkers that had taken months to build were reduced to rubble in seconds. Chief Petty Officer Mike Sullivan, a veteran of the Atlantic Campaign who had joined us before Iwo Jima, came up to me during the afternoon. Sullivan had been in the Navy for 18 years and had seen action against German U-boats, but nothing had prepared him for this level of destruction. Mr. Morrison, he said, shaking his head as he watched another series of explosions bloom on the island, I've been in this Navy since 1927, and I've never seen anything like this. We're not just bombarding that island, we're racing it. He was right. The sustained fire from 8 American battleships was literally changing the geography of Iwo Jima. Hills were being flattened, valleys were being filled with debris, and the entire northern end of the island, where the Marines would land in 3 days, was being transformed into a wasteland of craters and rubble. But the most impressive aspect of the bombardment wasn't just the raw destructive power, it was the precision. From 18,000 yards away, our gunners were putting shells exactly where they needed to go. Fire control systems that had been science fiction just 10 years earlier now allowed us to hit targets with pinpoint accuracy. I watched Lieutenant Junior Grade Paul Anderson, our youngest fire control officer, work his magic with the analog computers that calculated firing solutions. Anderson was 22 years old and had graduated from the Naval Academy just 2 years earlier, but he handled the complex calculations with the skill of a veteran. Sir, Anderson called out, I've got a firing solution on that Japanese observation post on the eastern ridge. Range 19250 yards, bearing 047 degrees. Send it to turret number 1, I ordered. Anderson's calculations were perfect. The 3 shells from turret number 1 bracketed the observation post exactly, and when the smoke cleared, that position had been completely eliminated. Outstanding shooting, Anderson, I told him. That was right on the money. The young officer grinned with pride. Thank you, sir. These new Mark 8 fire control computers make all the difference. We can put a shell into a circle 50 yards across from 20,000 yards away. It was true. The Iowa-class battleships represented the pinnacle of World War II naval technology. The 16-inch guns could fire a shell nearly 24 miles with devastating accuracy. The armor-piercing shells could penetrate over 30 feet of reinforced concrete. The high explosive shells created craters large enough to bury a 3-story building. As evening approached on February 16th, we received orders to cease firing and take up positions for the night. The first day of the bombardment was complete, but the job was far from finished. I climbed up to the main gun director to get a better view of what we had accomplished. Through the powerful optics, I could see that Iwo Jima looked like a different island than it had that morning. The Japanese fortifications that intelligence had warned us about were simply gone. In their place was a landscape of destruction that defied description. Dear God, I whispered to myself, what have we done? But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. We had done exactly what we needed to do. Every bunker we had destroyed, every gun we had silenced, every fortification we had eliminated meant that American Marines would have a better chance of survival when they hit those beaches in 3 days. The second day of bombardment began before dawn on February 17th. This time, we had even better intelligence about Japanese positions. Reconnaissance flights during the night had identified targets that had survived the first day's bombardment, and we were ready to finish the job. The Japanese had made some attempts to repair their positions during the night, but it was futile. As soon as the sun rose, American shells began falling on Iwo Jima again with renewed intensity. I was standing next to Captain McCrae when the first reports came in from our spotter aircraft. Iowa, this is Air Spot 1. The enemy has moved several artillery pieces to new positions on the western slope. Request immediate fire mission. You heard him, Morrison, the captain said. Let's take out those guns before they can cause trouble for the landing force. The fire mission took less than 10 minutes to complete. 6 shells from the Iowa's main battery landed directly on the Japanese artillery position, destroying the guns and their crews completely. It was becoming routine. Throughout the second day, we continued the systematic destruction of Japanese defenses. The other battleships in our formation were equally effective. The USS Missouri alone fired over 200 rounds of 16-inch ammunition that day. The older battleships with their 14-inch guns added hundreds more shells to the barrage. But it was the Iowa-class ships that were doing the heavy lifting. Our 16-inch guns were in a class by themselves. Each shell carried enough explosive power to level a city block. When fired together, the 9 guns of a single Iowa-class battleship could deliver more destructive power than an entire World War I artillery division. Midway through the second day, we received an unexpected visitor. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious forces that would land on Iwo Jima, came aboard the Iowa by helicopter to observe the bombardment firsthand. I was honored to brief the admiral on our progress. Sir, I told him, pointing to a detailed chart of the island, we've systematically engaged and destroyed over 60% of the identified Japanese defensive positions. Our shells have eliminated most of the concrete bunkers, collapsed several tunnel entrances, and destroyed at least 12 artillery batteries. Admiral Turner studied the chart carefully. What about the caves, Commander? Intelligence tells us the Japanese have extensive cave systems throughout the island. Sir, our armor-piercing shells can penetrate deep into the rock, I explained. We've been targeting cave entrances specifically. While we can't destroy the entire tunnel system, we've certainly made it much more difficult for the Japanese to move men and supplies through their underground network. The Admiral nodded approvingly. Outstanding work, Morrison. The Marines are going to be very grateful for what you boys have accomplished here. As if to emphasize his point, we heard the familiar roar of the Iowa's main guns firing another salvo. Through the bridge windows, we could see the shells impact on Iwo Jima, sending up the now familiar geysers of smoke and debris. Every shell we fire saves Marine lives, Admiral Turner said quietly. Don't ever forget that. The third and final day of the pre-invasion bombardment was the most intense yet. We had identified the remaining Japanese positions, and we were determined to eliminate every single one before the Marines landed. The morning began with a coordinated strike by all 8 battleships in the bombardment group. At exactly 0700 hours, over 50 heavy guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable, like a continuous roll of thunder that shook the ocean itself. I watched through my binoculars as the combined firepower of the American battleships fell on Iwo Jima like a steel rain. Entire sections of the island disappeared under clouds of smoke and flying debris. When the smoke cleared, I could see that what had been a fortress was now a wasteland. Sir, Lieutenant Chen reported, we fired over 400 rounds of 16-inch ammunition in the past 3 days. The Missouri and Wisconsin have fired similar amounts. The entire bombardment group has put over 3,000 heavy shells into that island. 3,000 shells. Each one weighing between 1,400 and 2,700 pounds. The total weight of metal and explosives we had thrown at Iwo Jima exceeded 8,000 tons, more than the gross tonnage of many destroyers. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the quantity of shells we had fired, it was the accuracy with which Ware had fired them. American naval gunnery had reached a level of precision that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. We were hitting targets from 18 miles away with shells that landed within yards of their intended impact points. As the final day of bombardment drew to a close, I found myself thinking about the Japanese soldiers who had endured 3 days of continuous shelling. 22,000 men had been dug into that island when we started firing. How many of them were still alive? How many of their guns were still operational? How many of their fortifications were still intact? The answer, as we would learn when the Marines landed 3 days later, was frighteningly few. The Japanese had built what they thought was an impregnable fortress on Iwo Jima. They had spent months preparing defensive positions that should have been able to hold off an invasion indefinitely. But they had not reckoned with the devastating power of American 16-inch naval guns. The final salvo of the bombardment came at 1800 hours on February 18th. All 9 of the Iowa's main guns fired together one last time, sending nearly 8 tons of steel and high explosive crashing into the Japanese positions. As the sound of the guns echoed across the water and the smoke cleared from the island, an eerie silence fell over the Pacific. Captain McCrae came up to me as I was securing my equipment. "Morrison," he said, "in 3 days, we fired more ammunition than most battleships fire in an entire war. What do you think we've accomplished?" I looked toward Iwo Jima, now barely visible in the evening haze. Where 3 days earlier there had been a formidable fortress bristling with guns and concrete bunkers, there was now a smoking ruin. "Sir," I replied, "I think we've just shown the world what American naval power can accomplish. Those Japanese positions aren't positions anymore. They're craters." The captain nodded grimly. "Let's hope the Marines agree with you when they hit those beaches." 3 days later, on February 19, 1945, 30,000 United States Marines stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima. What they found was an island that had been transformed by American naval gunfire. The massive concrete bunkers that should have dominated the landing beaches were gone, replaced by shell craters 40 feet across. The artillery batteries that should have torn the landing craft apart had been silenced. The observation posts that should have directed devastating fire on the assault troops had been obliterated. The Marines still faced fierce resistance from Japanese troops who had survived in deep caves and tunnels, and the battle for Iwo Jima would rage for another month. But the pre-invasion bombardment had accomplished its mission. Instead of landing under the guns of intact fortifications, the Marines found themselves fighting an enemy whose defensive network had been systematically destroyed by American naval gunfire. From my position on the Iowa, now stationed several miles offshore to provide fire support for the ground troops, I watched the landing craft approach the beaches. I thought about the shells we had fired, the targets we had destroyed, the precision with which American naval gunnery had prepared the way for this assault. The 16-inch guns of the Iowa-class battleships had proven themselves to be the most effective siege weapons in history. In 3 days of bombardment, we had accomplished what might have taken months of ground fighting to achieve. We had turned a fortress into a wasteland, and in doing so, we had saved thousands of American lives. But as I watched the Marines advance inland under continued fire from Japanese positions that had survived our bombardment, I realized that victory always comes at a price. The awesome power of American naval gunfire had made the invasion possible, but it could not make it easy. Men would still have to fight and die to take that island. Standing on the bridge of the Iowa as the battle for Iwo Jima began, I felt a mixture of pride and humility. Pride in what American technology and seamanship had accomplished, the most devastating and accurate naval bombardment in history. Humility in the face of the courage it would take to complete the job we had started. The 16-inch guns had done their work. Now it was up to the Marines to finish it. Years later, when people asked me about my service in World War II, I would tell them about those 3 days when American battleships turned Iwo Jima from a fortress into a wasteland. I would describe the awesome power of 16-inch naval rifles, the precision of American gunnery, and the systematic destruction of Japanese defensive positions. But most of all, I would remember the moment when I realized that their bunkers weren't bunkers anymore. They were craters, and in those craters lay the proof that American naval power, properly applied, could overcome any defense the enemy could devise. The Iowa-class battleships had written their names in history with shells that weighed as much as automobiles and flew through the air faster than sound itself. We had shown the world what American steel could accomplish when it was forged into weapons of precision and power. Japan had built a fortress on Iwo Jima. We had reduced it to rubble in 3 days. That was the measure of American naval supremacy in the Pacific, and it was a lesson that would echo across the ocean for generations to come. When the final tally was made, the pre-invasion bombardment of Iwo Jima had consumed over 3,000 rounds of heavy naval ammunition, more firepower than had been expended in most entire battle-soft previous wars. The Japanese defenders had been so thoroughly battered that their ability to resist the marine landing was reduced by an estimated 70%. But perhaps the most important lesson of the bombardment was not about the destructive power of American naval guns, but about the precision with which that power could be applied. The Iowa-class battleships had proven that they could hit targets with pinpoint accuracy from distances that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. As I stood on the deck of the Iowa, watching the last of the landing craft disappear into the smoke and haze of battle, I knew that I had witnessed something historic. The age of the battleship was coming to an end. Aircraft carriers would soon dominate naval warfare. But for 3 days in February 1945, the big guns had shown what they could do when American engineering, American courage, and American determination were combined into a single, devastating weapon. The bunkers weren't bunkers anymore. They were monuments to American power, carved in steel and high explosive, written across the landscape of a distant island in the Pacific. And every Marine who made it safely across those beaches owed his life, in part, to the 16-inch guns that had cleared the way. That was our victory. That was our legacy. That was what we had accomplished when Japan was stunned by the shells that rained from the sea.